The DA revealed gruesome new details about the murder. As Watts strangled his wife, it would have taken up to 4 minutes to end her life. Then he smothered his 2 daughters. 4-year-old Bella fought back as her dad was killing her.
In August of 2018, the Watts family was living what appeared to be the American dream. Chris Watts, a 33-year-old oilfield operator, and his wife, Shanann, a successful saleswoman, seemed to have it all. They had 2 beautiful daughters, Bella and Celeste, and a picture-perfect life. Their social media profiles were filled with happy family photos, vacation snaps, and posts about their loving home. But what if I told you that beneath that shiny exterior, there was something much darker lurking, something that would leave the world in shock? On August 13th, 2018, just days after returning from a family trip, everything changed. And I mean everything. Chris Watts, the man who had been seen as a loving husband and father, became the prime suspect in the horrific murders of his wife and children. But what led to this unimaginable act? What drove Chris, a man who had seemingly everything, to destroy it all? Stick with me, because in this documentary, we're going to break down the shocking details of the case. We're going to explore the chilling moments leading up to the murders, the investigation that uncovered Chris's dark secrets, and the real story behind the cold-blooded killer who had once been a family man. You won't believe how deep the deception ran. This is a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Let's dive in. Chris Watts was born on May 16, 1985 in Colorado, a state known for its breathtaking mountain views, vibrant cities, and close-knit communities. He was quiet, friendly, and well-liked by his peers. Nothing about his early life screamed future killer. In fact, as a young man, he was often described as polite, introverted, and fairly reserved. His teenage years were pretty unremarkable in the grand scheme of things. Chris graduated from high school in 2003, and like many people from small towns, he went on to chase what most would call the American dream. He found work at an oil company in the area, eventually landing a job with Anadarko Petroleum, a well-known oil and gas company. From the outside, things looked to be progressing smoothly. He was building a career, living a relatively quiet life, nothing out of the ordinary. By all appearances, Chris was living a life like anyone else. A steady job, a house to call home, and eventually a family of his own. But things weren't always as perfect as they seemed. In 2012, Chris met Shanann Watts, a woman who would change his life in ways he never could have imagined. Shanann was everything Chris wasn't: outgoing, confident, and full of energy. She had a strong social media presence, constantly posting about her life, sharing her struggles, and celebrating her victories. A natural leader, she quickly became involved in various online communities, and over time, she became a well-known figure in her circle. Shanann had a charisma that drew people in, and when she met Chris, she instantly saw something in him that no one else did. He was quieter, more introverted, but he was also kind, caring, and seemed to be genuinely smitten by her. They quickly hit it off, and before long, they were married. Chris had found someone who balanced his personality perfectly. While Shanann's world revolved around her children and her work, Chris seemed to grow more distant. On the surface, everything seemed fine. Chris was still working hard to provide for his family, and he did his best to play the part of the perfect husband and father. But inside, he was struggling. He was feeling the weight of his responsibilities. Financial pressures mounted, and Chris began to feel increasingly suffocated by the expectations placed on him. Meanwhile, Shanann was thriving. She was active on social media, building her own business and trying to keep her family's image in perfect shape. She was confident, outspoken, and proud of what they had built together. But Chris, behind the scenes, was becoming more and more emotionally distant, trapped in a marriage he didn't know how to navigate anymore. As the days passed, it seemed like nothing had changed, on the surface at least. Chris and Shanann's life continued as usual, but beneath that surface, things were slowly but inevitably falling apart. The pressures on Chris were mounting. He was still struggling with his job. His emotional distance from Shanann was growing, and he was now secretly dealing with an affair that would ultimately push him to the brink. While Shanann was away on a work trip to Arizona, Chris found himself alone with his thoughts that were getting darker. The emotional weight of his secret relationship with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger, began to consume him. The affair had started innocently enough, but it quickly turned into something much more. Chris began to envision a life with Nicole, one where he was free from the pressures of his family life, a life where he could start fresh, away from the responsibilities that were now suffocating him. Shanann was away, but Chris's mind was elsewhere. His feelings of guilt, shame, and longing for freedom began to collide. He wanted to escape his life, but more than that, he wanted to be with Nicole. The relationship with Shanann that had once been full of love and promise now felt like a prison, and in his mind, there was only one way out. Shanann, on the other hand, was unaware of the turmoil brewing just beneath the surface. She was excited to return home from her trip, eager to see her children and husband. She didn't know that Chris had already made up his mind about what he was going to do. The night before the murders, Chris and Shanann had a tense conversation about their marriage. Shanann had been asking him to open up, to share what was wrong, but Chris remained distant, offering no explanation. The cracks in their relationship were now visible to everyone, but Shanann had no idea just how far those cracks would stretch. Shanann left the house early the next morning, heading out for an appointment. It was then, with his family out of the house, that Chris made the decision that would change everything. His plan, which had been simmering in the back of his mind for days, was now set in motion, and within hours, it would all be over. The actions of that day remain some of the most horrifying in modern history. Chris Watts, a man who had once promised to love and protect his family, would soon carry out an unimaginable act, one that shattered everything. And it all started with a decision to take control of his life, at any cost. It's just past 2 a.m. on August 13th, 2018. Shanann Watts walks through the front door of her home after a long business trip. She's tired, probably hoping to sneak into bed next to her husband, maybe kiss her daughters good morning when they wake up. She never even made it to the morning. Chris claimed it started with an argument. Shanann had found out about his affair. She wanted answers. She wanted honesty. But instead of telling her the truth, he told her it was over, that he didn't love her anymore. And that's when he snapped. Or maybe that's when he decided. Chris straddled Shanann on the bed and began to strangle her with his bare hands, a woman carrying his unborn child. She fought for her life. Scratches were later found on his neck, signs that she resisted. But Chris didn't stop until she was gone, and while all this was happening, their daughters were just steps away, asleep in their beds. Here's where it turns from horrific to completely unthinkable. After killing Shanann, Chris wrapped her body in a sheet, carried her down the stairs, past photos of their wedding, past birthday drawings from their daughters. He laid her body in the back of his work truck. And then he brought out Bella and Cece, alive, awake, confused. He told them their mommy was sick. He loaded his 2 little girls, ages 4 and 3, into the back seat, right beside their mother's dead body, and then he drove. For 45 minutes, Chris drove with his daughters in the back seat. We don't know what was said during that ride, what Bella and Cece were thinking, but what we do know is that when they arrived at the oil site, they were still alive. This is where it becomes unbearable to even speak. Chris laid Shanann's body on the ground. Then, He turned to his daughters. He smothered Cece first, with her favorite blanket. Bella watched. She knew what was happening, and as Chris approached her next, he forced both of their small bodies into separate oil tanks just 8 inches wide at the opening. Then he buried Shanann and their unborn son Nico in a shallow grave nearby. And just like that, they were gone, erased.
And what was the conversation this morning you guys had?
It was about selling the house and the separation.
And how'd she take that?
We were both pretty emotional. We were both crying.
And then did you see her before you went to work? Did you say anything to her?
When she went back, when she told me she was going to go to her friend's house and be with the kid.
He then drove back home, texted co-workers, acted normal, even asked the realtor about selling the house, as if none of it had happened. Chris Watts didn't break in a moment of blind rage. He made decision after decision, methodically, coldly. He tried to control every piece of the aftermath, but in doing so, he exposed just how empty his soul had become. The truth was beginning to unravel. Chris had done the unthinkable, but as the hours passed, the reality of his actions started to set in. The police had already begun their investigation. Shanann's friends and family were starting to ask questions. It was only a matter of time before Chris was cornered, and when that moment came, the facade he had been maintaining for days began to crack.
But the fact that he was in here and explaining to it over and over and over, well, he doesn't look worried. He looks like he's trying to cover his track. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But if he's loaded with stuff, why isn't he walking back and forth?
The police quickly pieced together that Shanann and her daughters were missing. With Chris's calm demeanor and odd behavior, they began to suspect something more sinister was at play. As the investigation intensified, so did the pressure on Chris, and in the end, it wasn't the evidence that broke him, it was the pressure of his own guilt. Detective Tammy Lee, a seasoned investigator with years of experience, sat across from Chris, carefully watching his every move. She knew something was off, but she didn't need to push too hard. Chris was unraveling all on his own. The pressure was too much. Chris was about to crack, and in the silence of that room, the truth came spilling out. It didn't take long. Chris, a man who had once seemed like a loving father and husband, finally admitted to what he had done. His voice, barely above a whisper, confessed to the unspeakable. Chris described how, in a moment of rage, he murdered Shanann, choking her to death in their bedroom. He went on to explain that he then turned on his 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, who were helpless in their father's grip. Chris's confession was bone-chilling, not just because of the brutal details, but because of how cold and methodical he sounded. He didn't show remorse, he didn't flinch. His calmness in the face of such unimaginable violence sent shockwaves through the room. For Chris, the murders of Shanann and their daughters weren't an act of rage. They were part of a plan to escape his life, to erase his past. As he spoke, he revealed the chilling truth that this wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated decision. A decision born out of frustration, lies, and a desire to break free from the chains he had created for himself. In the courtroom, Chris's expression was one of detachment, almost as if he was simply recounting a bad dream. But for the family and friends of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, the pain of hearing the details of their murders in Chris's own voice was unbearable. Shanann's parents, her friends, and even her colleagues, who had known her as a vibrant and loving mother, were left in a state of shock and disbelief. The man they had all trusted and cared for had become something far worse than anyone could have imagined. The devastation was not just for the victims, but for everyone who loved them. Shanann's family could not understand how someone they had welcomed into their lives could commit such horrific acts. The man who had seemed like a perfect husband and father was, in reality, hiding a dark and violent side, one that no one could have ever foreseen.